This one is spectacular. Okay, so this is from Healthline. Healthline is a publication. I believe they are connected with Men's Health in some way, and they have something reviewed by Janet Brito, PhD. It's called the LGBTQIA ZBYL Safe Sex Guide. It's good times. And here is, it's so good. It's so good. So they have decided they are going to rename genitalia, rename them to be more sensitive to transgender folks. You ready for this? It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. For the 1,000th time, my wife happens to be a doctor, which means she uses medical terminology. Even when I teach my children what genitalia are, my daughter is 4.5 years old and knows the name of genitalia, and then she calls it her private zone. She uses a euphemism. Just like most parents, I don't want my kids running around in stores screaming penis or vagina, right? That's just what we do. But that's because my children are children. And when we actually discuss actual biology, it's good to know the terminology and not to say pee-pee, right? It's good to know the actual terminology. However, it's apparently very, very bad. Very bad. Because here's what Healthline says. These guides, too many guides with regard to LGBTQ issues, often unnecessarily gender body parts as being male parts and female parts. So yes, correct. You know, like in every sexually dimorphic species, which is to say every animal species on planet Earth, the penis is a male part and the vagina is a female part because these still have biological meanings because we're not idiots, but apparently we are idiots. I've assumed too much. Okay, these guides often unnecessarily gender body parts as being male parts and female parts and refer to sex with women or sex with men, excluding those who identify as non-binary. Okay, you can't have sex with a non-binary body part. It doesn't exist. That's not a thing. Unless you are screwing a tree. That's not a thing. And many individuals don't see body parts as having a gender. People have a gender. But body parts have a sex. What in the world are you talking about? Are you saying that it's just some sort of social construct that the presence of a penis seems to be connected with male genetics? That's a social construct? Okay, I can't wait to give you the punchline to this because the punchline to this is so unbelievably good. Okay, the punchline is just, it's astonishingly good. But okay, so here is the punchline to this LGBTQIA ZAY guide. Okay, here's the punchline. So they've already said these guides unnecessarily gender body parts as being male parts and female parts. So here's their solution. Here's their solution. The notion that a penis is exclusively a male body part and a vulva is exclusively a female body part is inaccurate. No, it's not. By using the word parts to talk about genitals and using medical terms for anatomy without attaching a gender to it, we become much more able to effectively discuss safe sex in a way that's clear and inclusive. For the purpose, here it is. It's so good. It's so good. Okay, there's no way to pitch how good this is. For the purposes of this guide, we will refer to the vagina as the front hole instead of solely using the medical term vagina. This is gender-inclusive language that's considerate of the fact that some trans people don't identify with the labels the medical community attaches to their genitals. The front hole. Okay, so, again, my wife's a doctor. If she is doing a gynecological exam, she is not going to ask a biological woman if she can see her front hole, because that's absurd. That is ridiculous. And I'm afraid that these folks are mixing up their face hole with their rear hole, because basically their head is up their ass. That's what I'm trying to tell you here. That is so ridiculous. But this is how far we've come. You want to know why you got Trump? This is why you got Trump. I know. Everybody's like, what does this have to do with Trump? It has to do with, everybody looks at these stories and we go, that guy, okay, fine, whatever. You're going to do this? Fine. That ridiculous human being. Let's just make him president. I don't even give a crap anymore. At least he's not doing front hole. At least we're not going to have a Democratic debate. You're not going to see a Republican debate where they argue over the proper terminology for terms that have been settled by science for all of history. So we're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. Honest to God, front hole. Yeah, Democrats, let's keep going down let's explore these paths. That's just great. Meanwhile, in other ridiculous stories today, this is an amazing story. So we talked yesterday about Asia Argento. Asia Argento is one of the Me Too leaders, and she has said that we should believe all women, we should believe all victims, except for that 17-year-old boy that she apparently molested, right? Who apparently she paid $380,000 to silence. He was a child actor. And when she was 37 and he was 17, she invited him to a hotel room where she apparently essentially had sex with him. Well, she said Tuesday that she never had any sexual relationship with a man who has accused her of molesting him, which is weird since he actually forwarded a picture of her in bed with him at a hotel to the New York Times. But here's what she says. She said Tuesday she'd never had any sexual relationship with a man who was accused her of molesting him when he was a minor, and that her former boyfriend, the late Anthony Bourdain, urged her to agree to a financial settlement to end the man's long-standing persecution of her. So that's a strong tactic. Blame the dude who just hung himself. That seems like that's a very strong move by Asia Argento. If that's not true, then she is not only a terrible person, she is the terrible person. That is about as terrible as it gets. Again, what's amazing about this whole phenomenon with Asia Argento is to watch people give her the benefit of the doubt in an area they would not give anybody else the benefit of the doubt. You know, the Bible is very clear about judging. And what the Bible says, it's a very interesting verse. The Bible says, I rarely quote the Bible, but this is an actual moral rule. And the moral rule is when you judge, you are not supposed to judge in benefit of the rich or in benefit of the poor. Why would the Bible specify you're not supposed to judge in benefit of the poor? We all understand it would have to specify don't judge in favor of the rich because corruption tends to come from rich people who can pay off judges. But the notion of sympathy for particular victims allows people to make unjust decisions. Okay, that is what is happening here. There are a lot of folks on the left who are rushing to Asia Argento's defense and providing her with all sorts of credibility because they like Asia Argento. We see this on all sides. When President Trump is accused of sexual abuse, people who like Trump are like, none of that's true. And then when Keith Ellison is accused of sexual abuse, people on the right are like, yeah, that's totally true. And exactly the reverse for Democrats. You got to have one standard of guilt or innocence, and you have to have one standard for the level of evidence necessary in order for us to determine whether somebody is actually responsible for behavior or not. The double standard is pretty telling, and that's a pretty shocking move by Asia Argento right there. If that's not true, she's got a real problem. Okay, meanwhile, a big story that broke last night is that over at the University of North Carolina, protesters knocked over a pro-Confederate statue from 1913. Here's some video. Here's what it sounded like when a bunch of students decided to topple Silent Sam, which is a 1913 statue placed on campus in memoriam of the 300 alumni who served in the Confederate Army. Here's what it sounded like. So they're pulling down the statue, and people are celebrating and cheering and kicking the statue and stomping on the statue as though they've just pulled down a statue of Stalin or a statue of Saddam Hussein in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union or the destruction of the Hussein regime. I think that there is a solid case that Silent Sam should not be on public property. I'm not a big fan of removing monuments. I tend to agree with Condoleezza Rice, who I think made this case very well. She says, I'm a firm believer in keep your history before you, and so I don't actually want to rename things that were named for slave owners. I want us to have to look at those names and recognize what they did, and to be able to tell our kids what they did, and for them to have a sense of their own history. When you start wiping out your history, sanitizing your history to make you feel better, it's a bad thing. I agree with Condoleezza Rice. I think that people should be forced to look at that statue and then cope with the legacy of slavery in the United States and the legacy of the Confederacy. It is not fair to say that this statue was merely a sort of anodyne tribute to people who died in a war, because when it was actually dedicated in 1913, it was pretty obviously a symbol of anti-black hatred at the time. Julian Carr, who was a local KKK member who helped dedicate the statue, said this at the actual dedication ceremony. He said, there are no words that I have been able to find in the vocabulary of the English language that adequately express my feelings in the presence of this occasion. And then he gets to the truly horrible part. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed the pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterwards slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head. So, yeah, the statue was pretty well connected with some awful, egregious, evil behavior, no question. But does that mean that we should start tearing down statues? I don't think, number one, we should tear down statues. And number two, I don't think statues should be removed, number one. Number two, I think that we are setting a really bad precedent when we are actually having mobs of people tear down statues. Okay, for a couple of reasons. The main reason why it's really bad when people tear down statues, when mobs tear down statues, is that you understand why people did it in the former Soviet Union or why people did it in the Hussein regime, because legitimately a regime that was repressive had fallen. There was no government that had now taken sort of control to get rid of the old vestiges. And so the people, in a fit of wild enthusiasm, tore down these old symbols of tyranny. But we have a democratic government in the United States. We have a democratic republic in the United States. The governor of North Carolina is a Democrat who doesn't actually like this monument. If you're telling me that the people who run the University of North Carolina are people who are emissaries of white supremacy, you're out of your mind. I mean, the people who run that university are very much on the left. These are people who really oppose, I'm sure, oppose that statue. The point is that in the United States, where you actually have a redress of grievances available through the democratic process, to use mob rule as an excuse to do this is really bad, and it actually leads to some even worse stuff. So I got a letter from a student at UNC last night to tell me about this stuff. And here's what the student wrote, quote, "I am a freshman at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Tonight, students tore down a Confederate statue on campus that is known as Silent Sam. Peaceful protesters acted just like their name suggests and destroyed this piece of history, chanting Black Power and Go Away Cops when police arrived on the scene." By the way, it's worth noting that if you think that the system of white supremacy is still in the offing in the United States, in 1913, when an evil KKK member horsewhipped a black woman for no apparent reason in front of a garrison of 100 federal officers who did nothing, okay, the reverse happened last night. A bunch of police officers stood around while a bunch of students tore down a statue in honor of the Confederacy. And they stood around. Only one person was arrested. And they were standing there. They could see he was destroying public property. They didn't do anything about it because they decided that it was worthwhile to tear it down. Now, I don't think the cops should have stood around for that. I think the law should be enforced, whatever the law is, in a democratic republic. But let's also note that those same police officers are not exactly standing up for white supremacy when they stand around allowing people to tear down a Confederate statue. That's just silly. Hey, here's what the student continued to say. Here's where it gets ugly. He says, "I walked by to see what I figured was going to be national news, and that was probably not the smartest thing for me to do. Almost immediately, some of these protesters started coming at me, yelling, 'Get out of here, Whitey,' which I found ironic because they were holding a sign that said, 'From Durham to Charlottesville to the White House, tear down racism.' Needless to say, I ran back to my dorm pretty darn fast." I was hearing from several students who had similar experiences at UNC. So it turns out that anti-racism only extends as far as battling the quote-unquote superstructure of white supremacy. It doesn't actually extend to not yelling at people who happen to be white walking by this rally as it's happening.